Hi, my name is Mustapha Mir. This is my partner Gino Labossa, and today we're going to be talking about language, gender, the implications of both, and how they correlate. Um, Gino's going to start off with his portion. I'm going to go afterwards, and afterwards we're just going to discuss a little bit. So right now I'm going to hand it off to Gino. Here you go, man.
Did you get beautiful? Alrighty, class. Hello, welcome. My name is Gino Labossa. Today, we are going over what is language, gender, and how they correlate. So this presentation starts off with how we view language and gender today. Language is a process that is constantly evolving throughout time. You can see it in the way that we used to speak back in the day towards now. And it's a social aspect that is an all-encompassing fact in our culture and today. So what is language? Language is the shared social construct that we all participate in, like I was talking about earlier. It facilitates itself and manifests in numerous different realms of our lives. For how we identify the self, this comes into contact of relation to today of pronouns, and just overall identification of the self. It's how we share and express our values, morals, and belief systems. And it's also how we come to mutual agreement, both formally and informally. So with this being said, we make agreements every day and do handshakes, so to speak, or within our interpersonal relationships, and this legally, formally, and version of contracts, anything that you're signing your name on or anything like that, we don't really realize it at first, but once we think about how language shapes our perception of the world and all the things around it, it really does come into full swing. Two people can define the same word and still be a disagreement over it, of what's being said, and that's okay. And every social interaction that we have is mediated through language. So we can come to these different conclusions on definitions, and both people still can't technically be right because cultures have different interpretations of these things, and these are all things that we need to take into account when we are talking with someone and to have what it means to be effective communicators, so to speak. When it comes to gender, gender is not something we are born with or even something we possess, but rather this is something that we do. It's a social performance of self-expression. This is pulled from the Eckert, Penelope, and McConnell reading called with What is Gender? And it really just goes to show of how gender is kind of more of a performance of how we express ourselves. It's something that we learn when we're first born. And the etiquette is not directly taught to children per se, but it's learned through their experience in life. And we see this all the time with just how nature versus nurture, with two identical twins can come to be the same, but differently throughout their perceptions. When we look at the relationship of the genders between the two, gender is embedded thoroughly within our institutions, our actions, and our beliefs and desires. The construct and overall understanding of gender is inherently integrated through our language and self-expression. And we use language to describe our gender as well as defining it. So once you see that gender and language have an interacting role with one another, and at the end of the day, we really are responsible for the words we are saying and what they even mean, because it's a participatory process. We all contribute to the understanding of these words and how we facilitate them. And when it comes to the implications of our definitions, when persons of power begin defining what is and what isn't, it begins to affect people that is beyond themselves, that they can't even relate to them or see what it is to be not a he or she. It's not even a concept that they can understand, but they are still implementing laws and things that affect these people that they can't, and it leads to just an unfair participatory process within our legal proceedings, and it affects numerous different realms. I mean, the legal proceedings, as we saw within our readings as well, of the Olympic um, medalist who is getting stripped because she's found to be a hermaphrodite, when that's completely fine. That's God's creation, and that's not something that can be taken away from that person. But since we have such rigid guidelines of what he and she is, and if it's not something that, then it's different, and it's not something that we approach like a culture should, because we need to be more inclusive of all these different types of genders. And the implications, I mean, you can see this happening through the mislabeling effect that occurs through our understanding of he or she. And this happens when the moment a child is born and you try to refer to it not as it. You have to pick he or she. And for us, the general understanding is there's only two. And it gives off the connotation that we only accept those two. And it's our duty, I believe, to try to find some more middle ground for some more inclusivity of all people involved. So that is my take on what language is gender and the implications of that. And now I will be handing this over to Mustapha to finish up with his side. If I can just go over, make him host right here, and he will begin.
Make sure you stop sharing your screen, by the way.
I'm trying right now.
There you go. Right on. So like I said before, my name is Mustapha Mir. I'm gonna be going over my take. Let's go. Language and gender. I don't know how to get it out of this blocky thing, so you're just gonna have to live with seeing that bar up there. Suffer. What is language? So in anthropology, it's defined as an arbitrary symbol shared among a group. These symbols may be verbal, signed, or written. It is one of the primary ways we communicate or send and receive messages. To point how important language is, all culture have one, with each language being no more efficient than the other. That's the thing. Each language has its own purpose in that society, and it is one of the most important aspects wherever you go around the world. Language is always adapting and changing depending on the way people use it. As I said before, different people use different language in different ways. You're not going to go to West Europe and expect them to talk the same way Eastern Europeans do. Even if they live so close, the way they use language is extremely different, and it's important to know the implications. The only constant language is, no matter what social structure, as I said before, it is one of the most important aspects, because without that organization and expression, you wouldn't be able to live in a modern society like we do now. It would be extremely disorganized. No one would be able to get the things done the way we do now. Without language as a root of communication, the way we live now just wouldn't exist. It's so important. Even animals have their own versions of language, even if it isn't as complex as ours. It's something that this world has everything together, and each animal even shares that. Each person is rooted in their language. Without that aspect, you wouldn't be able to really express yourself or even understand me, to be honest. Me talking to Gina right now would be completely impossible. To put it, language is, I hate to use this word, but because it's really general. Language is the building block of society. That's the way I put it. Gender I like to see is kind of like a subroot of language. It is a version of expression, and the way anthropology used to describe it as a social culture categorizing defined by the meanings given to biological differences between the sexes. This is an extremely old way of viewing a gender. More modern takes see it as more of a social construct, not really rooted as in sex or biology. How people perceive themselves is important when it comes to intermingling with one another, because no one wants to be No one wants to be not defined or not express themselves or seem as if they're not important. It's important for a person to share that aspect about themselves, and gender helps with that. For example, let's look at the intersex and the travesti. The intersex, you can't, it was argued you can't even call them male or female. So intersex was created for them to be able to express that fact. Same with the travesti. They're not, they don't necessarily call themselves homosexual or are the less correct term drag queens. They consider themselves a completely different thing. They're not really related to any other form. You can't really correlate them with how other people see themselves because that is how they look at themselves. Um, Culture anthropology has done its best differentiating between sex and gender when gender coming out as entirely socially driven. Biology has a little sway over gender. That's what I believe. Biology can't really correlate itself with it. The only reason people do so, I believe, is because some people can't really look past the whole you're born either male or female. And that argument sadly just becomes kind of like a staple whenever you talk about gender. How language and gender correlate is actually the best way to put it is all language is gender, but not all gender is language. And what I mean by that is, as I said before, language was a form of expression. Well, gender basically is that it is a form of expression, but on a really a pinpointed part. Like it's not as general as language. It's more direct in its approach and how it's expressing a person. In reality, people tend to categorize themselves outside of appearances. As Burgill Victoria states, it's an automatic division of human into female and male gender roles justified. You can't really just give someone that label off birth because they might not view themselves, but depending on how society views male. As I said before, the travesti, they are born male, yes, but do they view themselves as male? No, they view themselves as inherently extremely feminine. They don't take on those roles as a male would in that society. And let's go with how people, homosexuals. In the past, homosexuals was a term used, it was a derogatory term, but people eventually adopted that language and they still consider themselves male, but they aren't inherently feminine. If that, with that kind of justification in mind, it's not really fair to base people on that. If you are male, you have to do this. If you are female, you have to do this. It's all about expressing yourself. And even between people who consider themselves queer and homosexual, they consider themselves completely different from each other. Even if you, at like first glance, you might see them as like somewhat the same thing. Language is constantly changing, and it's because language is gendering, and this is for all language is gender. It's not fair for gender to stay the same all the time. It needs to evolve with its people. We've gone through this in generation from like the early 20th century to the early 21st. People have viewed gender as something increasingly different. We're evolving with that new idea of what gender is because, as I said before, that is language. It is always going to change with its people. They are both complex concepts that aren't tied down to one mode of thinking or any biological process. One group can find the concept of talking on masculine as like something different, like me talking in a high-pitched voice, that could be considered like feminine and not masculine. Another people can say like, hey, I'm raising my voice. That's a pretty masculine thing to do. That's completely, they're both completely different talking points. The implications of these process, I think the best way to view the idea of language and gender is working as a form of expression and go back to how society structures itself. We're always looking in on ourselves. I think the best thing to do with this new idea is, well, it's not really a new idea, but more of something that needs to be discussed, is to look back on how we view gender and try and find a niche for each group, and not really to like set roles as we did before, but set up like an open idea of what you can do and what you can express yourself. But if you're confused, you can go back and look upon yourself and you won't come across the block of male, female, or straight up just like people put saying like, oh, you're like this, so you must be intersex, or you're like this. No, you might even feel like that completely, but you might be put into those roles. concepts like mothers and fathers would be seen as different based on how people interact with the next generation. The biggest thing that I think would change would be people would be more progressive in their understanding of individuals and how they express each other. People don't really like to, like how my partner Labossa said, that one runner who was just completely kicked out or not able to participate. That if we had this understanding, maybe people wouldn't see like just straight up, oh, so that person is like this, they must be like this, they cannot participate. I feel like it would be more inclusive to people and people would actually feel like they fit in. You're my sources on the whole thing. Sorry if I stuttered through all of that, but that's just how I speak. So what do you
I
think,
think
Gino?
I think you brought up some really good points, Mustafa, and all very factual and objective as we were going through the course readings before. And a lot of it, I think we can all come into agreement of what it is, on what is gender, what is language, But when it comes to the implications, I feel like I was very interested in what it was that you were trying to get at, and
Yeah, I kind of like went through that. Here, I can go over that again.
no,
Implicate.
not at all. I think that would just be the great basis for us to have our talking point on.
Oh, okay.
Because I mean, what were you trying to get out when you're saying concepts like mothers and fathers would be seen different based on how they interact? Like, would that be a
So
positive or a negative in that regard?
so yeah, I think it would honestly be a positive because let me put this into your idea. Let's say you have a mother who works a 9 to 5 job. She really doesn't have enough time to like be at home to take care of the kids, and that's the traditional like idea. Like, hey, so the mother should be taking over. The father is in between jobs at the moment, so
Hmm.
he takes on that role, right? Do
Hmm.
you see that father now as a feminine like view? Do you see that father as more like a feminine view, or do you see him as like not appearing to role of a father? I'd say no, he is still technically acting like a father because
Hmm.
the way I view mother and father as are people who take care of their children. Now, how you do it can be completely different. I don't think it's right to like see that as completely feminine. And if people want to see as feminine and they're okay with viewing themselves like, hey, I'm taking on a feminine role, that's fine. But I like the idea of it being open up to interpretation, how people view that. Uh,
100%.
yeah, there
Um,
is one thing I want to talk for your
yeah.
viewpoints on language and gender.
Hmm.
I kind of made like a whole idea on like, hey, this is inherently important, what we need to talk about. How do
Hmm.
you exactly view, like, do you view language and gender as extremely important? Because I believe that's kind of like the building block on society. I think that's everything that's like built up on just language and gender itself. Without those
Hmm.
two, the things wouldn't, you know, really
Yeah.
well function together.
Uh-huh. Of course. I mean, language is obviously the foundation of any communication that we have with people, and it's the way that we communicate ideas. It's the way that we communicate our own necessities and our own like necessities that we need, So I
What kind of like
100,
necessities? Like,
it's the same way that when a baby can't cry or communicate any else way, he'll just cry for what he wants, like as we progress our language, we can attend to our needs that we can more specifically and more directly. And I it's a funny thing of how just language operates that way of how we are involved in that, like why is anything have the definition that it does, like we came to that through mutual agreement over time. For a tree is to be defined a tree, then that is a tree now, like that's our understanding of it, because over time, for whatever reasons, we have come to agree with that.
so you'd make the argument that if someone were to say that's not a tree, it would be correct, or would that be talking as a biological source and not a social concept?
Can you rephrase that?
So like that whole thing where you were going about the whole tree, if I were to come up to like a tree and say that's not a tree, that's a weed,
Yeah.
you I don't think I would necessarily say like I'm correct. I feel like when it comes to language and gender, it's really important to like do your best not to consider any biological aspect. I think what I'm disagreeing with most is like the term you're using. I feel like
let me stop you real quick. That I did an awful job with describing that, and the tree analogy is more my sense of just trying to say that, like, at a certain point in time, we didn't have a language, and at a certain point in time, we did start saying, like, okay, that's that, like, so all I was trying to put at is more of, it's a social thing, and it's just a social concept that we have come to agree upon,
okay,
I
okay, so
guess.
okay, I think I took the tree too literally. I think you
Yeah.
literally just yeah, no, I see what I okay, that was pretty dumb of me. That's actually a good talking. So if we're gonna take that into consideration, what about
Mhm,
when people actually correlate gender with objects, like how in Spanish, people
mhm,
are going to give like a refrigerator a feminine turn, and then like
mhm.
if you're going to view that the same way as I view language gender, do you think my interpretation or your interpretation could fit into that category, or is that something that that's something that a different culture sees, and we'd have to understand that culture to completely understand how they use language and gender?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal talking point, and props for bringing that up. I personally don't think that we can make those statements of it, because I mean, it goes into the same thing of when they're talking about it. If you're using la instead of el, in Spanish, that it still isn't always inherently to be what we put it as, like if you call someone a Mrs. who's a Mr., they're gonna get riled up, like it's gonna lead to conflict in this culture because we have such definite he, she terms. But when it comes to those terms where literal words are based in feminine or masculine pronouns and such, I think it leads to, I don't think we can understand it, no, as
No,
Americans
I
here.
think yeah, I think people would find so I know some people who might find an offense in giving those labels, but here's the one thing that I wanted to like bring up. This is the reason I bring this up the most.
Mhm,
It's not fair for one person to view themselves as a certain way without
mhm,
realizing that people might have different interpretations. Now, this isn't like I'm going to use trans people as like a talking point. A trans
mhm,
person, by all rights, has their right to call
mhm.
themselves what they want, correct?
Yeah.
And it would be rude for anybody else to look at them and say, like, no, you're like this. Because
Mhm,
my whole idea is how people view themselves is extremely important. And being able to express yourself shouldn't really have to be anything tied down to like a biological process. They have no control over that. What they do have
mhm.
control over is how they can express themselves and how they want to be treated. My
Exactly.
whole idea, my whole idea on this though is that same person can't then go to a different culture who views things something completely differently and try and like change how that interpretation is. Um, it's you don't have the right kind of like social background, not even social background. You don't have the right kind of like idea going into it because there's the one thing.
Contextual understanding almost, huh?
Yeah, yeah. The one thing my old anthropology teacher used to tell me is no matter what you do to try and like fit in with these people, you have to remember deep down, you are not like them. You are
Exactly.
not going to ever like extremely relate 100% to them. You're not going to have the same kind of relationship as if you were raised in that setting. And it doesn't have anything to do with race. It's more like most anthropologists come from usually a Western society, and they're moving into different areas. Same way it goes back and forth. So
Mhm,
when it comes to pronouns and stuff like that, I feel like people are never really going to understand each other. So the best way we can come to agreement on that is trying to find like a middle ground between each. And we've tried to do this before. The US has actually done this a lot recently with like gender neutral bathrooms, stuff like that, finding like a middle point, trying to
mhm,
make it so that everybody like feels excluded, which is amazing. But people are still going to you just have no control over how people are going to view those other people, and this could be from anyone. Like I said before, remember how I said in one of our perusal texts, I'm not sure which page it was, But you know how the one story about how people who call themselves homosexual don't view themselves as queer, or that one text where one dude was like, he was stating himself as, hey, I am a straight man who dates guys. I am not going to consider myself homosexual because how our society views homosexual is completely different. You're never going to like come to an exact middle ground, because if that was true, the LGBTQ wouldn't exist as it was. Lesbian, queer, trans, all of them, people can view them as kind of like the same thing, and you'd still be wrong for viewing it like that, because they're not, a lesbian person isn't going to say like, hey, I'm a queer. No, I'm lesbian.
Mhm. Exactly.
That's the only thing that that's like the one point I'm trying, sorry if I'm going on for a while, but that's the one thing
No.
that I want to like set this clear.
Yeah.
I don't think people have like a understanding on it. Do you think so, or?
The understanding of how calling someone a queer versus trans is different to them.
Yeah,
Is that
it's something like, do you think that we're ever going to get to a point where we can truly like come together and kind of like view these things outside of different forces, outside of different concepts?
yeah.
You think that ever could happen? Because I don't think it's possible with how we're set up now. We need to completely restructure everything about our society to like accommodate for everyone. And I don't
Yeah.
know if people are willing to do that.
Yeah. And I think goals like that, like that is the goal, like that is what we're ultimately striving for, is inclusivity with everyone. But as we know, as in modern psychology, like people group up and people like to distinct themselves from others, and it's a natural like systematic process through our cognition of just categorizing and labeling everything that we see to understand it, um and I think that brings us full circle kind of back to the beginning, and this would
Yeah.
almost be a good point to end, where it is simply that,
It
it's
always comes full circle, the circle of life, but in this case, it's a circle of language.
exactly, and it's so you can think of it as, you can get a macro view on it and look at it from that global perspective, like you're saying, of global inclusivity and trying to do it, and it affects even to the insides of how we define and perceive our reality, and it's like we're seeing, it's a very collaborative process that's easily influenced through our media, through how we talk. And I think it brings a certain obligation to us that we need to just continuing to bring awareness to all people and just try to have the inclusive entry points for everyone, so no one is coming out feeling that they're not being treated fairly.
That's the whole thing, but that's going to require a lot of work. And from the text we've read, I swear it's like always just like we were so close to finally understanding, but then it's always just a roadblock.
Yeah.
The travesti paper, I really like talking about that one because there was so much about it. It was
Uh-huh.
honestly just like a series of like, hey, that sounds pretty cool how they view it, but then I remember that they live in South America and in Brazil, and then that's not that's not a good place to live for people who are who considers themselves travesti, or
Yeah.
that's it's always just like one step forward, two steps back,
Yeah.
or in this
And I
case
mean,
five.
yeah, I mean, like we see, everything is systematic institutions and the legal proceedings, those involve language, and they are set up for those very reasons, to keep them in power and to exclude the people that they don't want, And I think that's what I mean of, it's always the goal, but do I think it's realistic or it's going to happen? Not in my lifetime. No, probably not. But
But
I
you think it
mean,
will happen eventually?
I can't say for sure. No. The world is a chaotic place, I I don't think it's inherently good either. I think there is good and bad with both of it, and we're all trying our best to I mean, no one goes about their day thinking they're inherently wrong in doing it. You know, everyone feels
Yeah.
justified within their own thing. And that's the beauty of it, is everyone has their different perceptions and what the words mean to them and how they're describing themselves, you know?
Oh,
So,
yeah. Like language, it's always going to evolve in a different way, and trying to like figure out how language is going to evolve next, especially when it comes to gender, is always going to be something really hard to do. I think it's almost impossible because people who lived in the 50s never thought America would look like it was today and how we view language. Um, almost feel like the way people use language 200 years ago, even though it's like just standard English, completely
mhm,
different. You wouldn't be able to like understand each other. Just even if like the words mean the same thing, it's just how those words are used are just going to, it's just not going to function. You can't put them together.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I think this is a good place to leave off on. It was nice talking to you, Gino.
You as well,
Hopefully,
Mustafa.
yeah. Hopefully this is enough for a professor. Have a nice night.
Professor, I love you. Thank you.
Oh my God.